Hi, everyone. So this week we're releasing a previous episode. It's Marc Andreessen from August 16, 2021, one of the first podcasts we did. We've been releasing CSPI podcast episodes bi-weekly for just over 2 years now. And it's come to the point where I simply can't keep up with the schedule, given my writing and other commitments. To be more precise, if I really tried, but I don't want to be in a position where I feel forced to put something out there, no matter what, in order to meet the schedule. Quality is important as my time is important. And I'm sure it is for all the listeners out there. So I'm going to be cutting back on podcasting, maybe releasing a few more old episodes like we're doing today, and still releasing new ones when there is someone I really want to talk to. So thanks for everyone's support over the last few years. And without further ado, here's my discussion with Marc Andreessen.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the CSPI podcast. I'm here with Marc Andreessen. Marc, how are you?
Hey, good morning, Richard. How are you?
I'm doing excellent. Thanks for joining us. I was looking at your schedule that you posted online a while back, and it's very busy. So I'm happy that you're making time for us. How do you describe? Most people, you're you're not going to need any introduction. But how do you describe what you do? What are you most proud of in your past? And can you just tell people a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so I've had three phases in my career. The way I think about it, so phase one was as an engineer, and software developer, and where I was lucky enough to be involved in the sort of formation of what of what we now call the internet. And so originally with the web, and then the web browser, and then a company called Netscape in the 1990s. That used to be famous, and some people still remember. And we kind of helped, we kind of helped what we now view as the consumer internet and the sort of business, internet, e-commerce, all these things kind of come into being in the 90s. And then phase two of my career was as an entrepreneur, and Netscape was my first company. And then I had two other companies myself, as I was a co-founder of after that. And then that ultimately led into my third career as an investor and venture capitalist. And actually, my fourth startup is my current firm, Andreessen Horowitz, which is a venture capital firm that invests, very broadly across technology of many different kinds, including a lot of internet technologies for sure, but also biotech and cryptocurrency and blockchain and many other areas of technology. And we've become a very active investor in the space. So I've kind of seen so far, kind of this industry and this world kind of from the perspective of a builder, a technology builder, a company builder, and now a financier.
Yeah, so I mean, a venture capitalist, I think that's a term many people hear, and then, they think it's such a common term that they often don't ask what it actually means or what it actually entails. I think a lot of our listeners are journalists or academics, so it's probably not a world that they're familiar with. Can you sort of explain what do you do as a venture capitalist?
Yeah, so in some ways, it's the most cutting edge area of finance, in that we're funding the new things. We're funding the new technologies. We make the bets on very fringe kind of ideas, many of which don't work. We kind of work with typically very idiosyncratic, strongly willed, iconoclastic entrepreneurs, who are not necessarily the kinds of people who you'd want running, a giant, a big bank or something, but are the right people to build a new technology company. And so there's a real leading edge component of it. On the other hand, it is also kind of the original form of investing, right? Like, when Christopher Columbus wanted to mount the expedition, to I guess what he thought was India turned out to be America. He went to Queen Isabella, and she was basically his venture capitalist, right? And she basically fronted him the money. When the Puritans, who kind of settled North America, wanted to set up their place here, they actually spent 20 years in the Netherlands, actually effectively raising venture capital to be able to finance their journey. There's actually this term in venture capital called carry. You'll hear so-called carried interest, which is the term that's basically the profit sharing that a VC like us gets when an investment works. That term carried interest actually derives from the whaling industry, like 500 years ago, 400 years ago. The relationship between a boat captain who was going to go out and try to hunt and kill a whale, And the investors who financed his expedition was literally structured like the deals we do, and the profit sharing was called carried interest because it was literally the percentage of the whale that the captain and the crew got to keep. It was literally the percentage of the whale that the ship would carry back to the back to the port. And so, even industries kind of that old and in many ways long forgotten, we're structured on a very similar model. And so, it's sort of the true financing of risk in the economy. And I would argue it plays a vital role, not just in the delivery of new technologies, right? And a recent example, it wasn't one of our companies, but this company Moderna that sort of innovated this idea of mRNA vaccines. It was a classic venture capital backed company. Like that company would not have existed without venture capital. That technology, these vaccines would not exist without venture capital. So so we kind of keep the train running in terms of new technologies, but I would also argue we keep the economy dynamic, right? Without venture capital, you would kind of have all economic activity over time consolidated into a very small number of big monopolies or oligopolistic companies, and there was a big fear in the American economy in the 50s and 60s, that was exactly what was happening to the American economy. And then, venture capital in its modern form really burst onto the scene in the 1970s, and it's really, I think, kept the American economy much more vital and fresh than it would have been otherwise.
Yeah, that's interesting. You mentioned the mRNA vaccine. I mean, it's one of those ideas as I've been thinking about academia and peer review and becoming disillusioned with it, and reading people like Nassim Nicholas Taleb, who similarly, is very down on it. I think the mRNA, the story behind that is that they couldn't even publish it in a journal, right? It was just something too new, too weird. And then the journal editors were like, "This is strange." What they look for is incremental progress on something everybody knows. And then you go to the market, and it tends to be the thing that works and potentially can transform medicine. So I've been thinking a lot about just incentive structures, and there's this idea that sort of how do you think about sort of the relationship between sort of what venture capitalists do and then people sort of in the world of how do I put this, the sort of the intellectual world where they're not they don't have as much skin in the game, and Taleb's terms. Do you understand what I'm saying? That I sort of see it as like incentives are becoming much more fundamental to my worldview, especially as I become disillusioned with academia. Do you think that's a good way to look at the world?
Yeah, so this is a really important topic, and it's a very, very rich and deep topic that we think about a lot. So I start with a disclaimer, basically saying that look, a lot of what we fund, a lot of the new technologies and companies that we fund, we do have to give credit to sort of in a lot of cases, sort of decades of university level research, and and often actually federally funded research, government funded research, that kind of lead up to the point where we get to do what we do. And so the technologies, for example, behind computer networking that ultimately resulted in the internet, right, were funded by DARPA starting in like the 1950s, right, and it wasn't really for another 30 years or something into the 80s and into the 90s that they kind of became fully commercially viable, and that then entrepreneurs like you were able to kind of pick up the ball and run with it, and sort of help turn those technologies into something that normal people could use. So there is So I just to say we do have to give credit to the fact that and look, mRNA builds on decades of federal funding of genomics research and university level work in genomics, and so that we wouldn't have a lot of these new technologies if there hadn't been any basic science. And then that takes me to kind of the second part of the observation, which is basic science is very hard to fund with a sort of purely capitalistic mindset. And I say that as a huge advocate of a purely capitalistic mindset. It's hard to fund basic research with that, and a big part of that is just some of it is you don't know what you're going to get out of basic research. Sometimes it takes 20 years or something to figure out like what the actual real world kind of products are going to be. But the other thing is like it just the time scale involved, right? So the way to think about it basically is what we do is we can finance companies from basically the way I think about what we do is we sort of finance sort of advanced research into development and productization, and the sort of time frame that our companies can operate on between inception and when they ship a viable product is sort of 5 to 7 years, right? And what you tend to find is if there's something where it's like, okay, there's a new technology and I know it's going to result in a viable product, but it's going to be 10 or 15 or 20 years out. It's very hard to do that from a venture capital mindset. And the reason is it's actually because it's very hard to do that from a company building standpoint. Because if you staff a company with employees, you need a team. And if you staff it and there's nothing to show for it after 5 to 7 or maybe 8 or 9 years, like at some point you lose that team. And so you just because these are very talented people. They can go work at other companies, and so it's very hard to make the timescales match for the sort of 20-year kind of intellectual journeys. Look, that said, something has gone very wrong in the basic research complex that we do have right in the universities and with the federal funding system. And we know that something has gone very wrong because of the replication crisis, right? And so John Ioannidis at Stanford, wrote this now classic paper in the mid '90s where he basically made the case that 50%. He basically said 50% of published research is fake. Is what's called non-reproducible, which means like you can't basically reproduce the same results, which means like you can't do anything with the research. It's basically fake. And interestingly, he was studying biomedical research, right, which you would think is an area of research where people would be very focused on getting things right. It subsequently turned out that he might have been underestimating the problem, right? The amount of fake research, even in fields like biomedicine, might be as fake as up to 70%. There's this other just amazing study that maybe we can link to for your listeners. That it was a study of medical trials funded by a branch of the federal apparatus. It's like heart and lung, whatever research. And it's this great chart that basically shows that new medicines stopped working at the point when the funders of the research required the researchers to register their experiments ahead of time.
Yeah.
And so basically it's this chart that basically shows that for like 30 years or something, you had all of these new medicines coming out that like basically, in the research results were like, wow, this thing really works and it should be given to patients. And then there's this point where the research or the people running medical trials were forced to pre-register their hypothesis with the funding agency. And so they were forced to basically say up front, here's exactly what we're testing for. Here's exactly how we're going to measure the results. And subsequent to that point, basically new medicines have stopped working. And the implication, there's two possible interpretations of this, right? One is, the low-hanging fruit argument, which is it used to be easier to make medicines that work, and now we've harvested the low-hanging fruit in science and technology, and now it's just harder to do it. And so maybe this is just a coincidence, right? The other explanation is those old medicines didn't work either, right? They were basically fake research results based on what's called data mining, right, or p-hacking. In such a way that basically the results are fraudulent. And then the implication is there are a lot of drugs on the market today that probably don't actually work. And so anyway, like the whole complex of science right now is like in an existential crisis. This is a real issue. And there are, there's now, by the way, there's a generation of scientists who now specialize in basically, pointing this out and analyzing it. Andrew Gellman and a whole bunch of others. I'll give you. I'll just give you an example. I had a conversation with the longtime head of one of the big federal funding agencies for healthcare research, who's also a very accomplished entrepreneur. And I said, do you really think it's true that 50% or 70% of biomedical research is fake? And he's, this is a guy who spent his life kind of in this world. And he said, oh no, that's not true at all. He said it's 90%.
Yeah.
Right. And I was like, holy shit, like, what do you like, and I was like flabbergasted. I was like, what do you mean 90%? And he said, well, look, he's like, there's this thing called Sturgeon's Law. He's like, look, 90% of everything is shit, right? Like, which is literally this thing called Sturgeon's Law. 90% of everything is bad. Like, so 90% of every novel written is bad. Every novel, novels, 90% of music, 90% of art, 90% of everything is bad. And so he said, look, you just need to realize, he said basically his analysis was, in any given field of medical experimentation, biomedical development, and this is going to be true of any field, right? There's like 5 labs total in the world that are like really good at what they're doing, and they're doing really cutting edge work. And this is also true of like quantum computing, and this is true of you pick any field of advanced technology you want. And he said those 5 labs have like a pretty good shot at doing interesting work, and some of that is going to reproduce, and some of it isn't. And there are issues even in those labs. He said once you get out of the top 5 labs, basically it's basically just like make work. It's like incremental marginal improvements at best, and basically just a complete waste of time otherwise. And I said, well, good God, like why does the other 90% continue to get funded if you know this? And he's like, well, there's all these universities, right? There are all these professors, they have tenure, there are all these journals, there's this whole system, right? And people have been promised lifetime employment. And anyway, long-winded way of basically saying, yeah, we have, I think, pretty serious structural and incentive problems in the research complex. And then, by the way, I would argue, like everything I just described, I'm just talking about the U.S. I would argue that like the U.S. is the best case scenario. Everywhere else is almost certainly worse. Yeah. And so we have a lot of work to do.
Yeah. So when you say that the 5 best labs are doing something, are doing things that are potentially important and interesting, do you think the limiting factor here is just human talent? Because when I read, my field is social science. I read political scientists and anthropologists, and the typical one writing 100 years ago, 50 years ago, was just so much more insightful than the typical person in these fields today. And part of it is just there's a lot more people in these fields today, and on average, they're just not going to be as good. And the people who became, who went into these fields, 50 to 100 years ago, had something more to say. Were doing more interesting things. Do you think it's just that? How much of it is just human talent, and how much of it is just the limit is just the way we've set things up?
Yeah, so I think there's a real argument, and this is kind of the most uncomfortable form of argument that people can make these days. But there is a real argument that there are just a certain number of like super elite people. There are just a certain number of people who are going to be like really good scientists, and it's just not that many. And it's some magical combination of intelligence and industriousness and honesty, right, integrity, and then curiosity, and then ability to recruit and build a team, and then ability to raise money. It's sort of this. It's a lot like being it's in some ways being a top researcher is like being an entrepreneur. Like you have to actually pull all these different kind of elements together. And there's just only a certain number of people who can do that. And so, like, I think there is something to that for sure. And then, of course, by the way, the implication of that is like, boy, from a societal standpoint, like we better really know who those people are, right? And we better really like give them room to run, right? And we really better make sure that they're not driven out, right? Like, but because what's the worst thing if somebody's really truly a member of the elite, like, and they're capable of generating elite level results, like, if you wanted to demotivate them and drive them out of the field, right? What would you do, right? Which is you would surround them with mediocrity, right? And you would drown them in bullshit, basically. And so I think there's an element of that. I think there's something else though, and I think you put your finger on it right up front with incentives. So I think one way of thinking, I've been thinking a lot about this recently. So I think one way of thinking about this is basically, right, it's like there was this wave in the, I don't know, call it between probably the very late 1800s and then in the first, 2 or 3 decades of the 1900s. And it was kind of, progressivism at that time. And then it was, Wilsonian, whatever they call Wilsonianism and Wilsonism. And then it was, all the time and motion studies in factories, and then it was the rise of bureaucracy and administration, and then it was the rise of kind of all the different ways that people have learned to organize military efforts being applied in other fields like business and academia, and then it was mass media, mass communication. You had this sort of rise of systems. Right. And so it's like, and this is when like, the university system as we know and understand it today kind of got organized and kind of, put into place. It's when, kind of the factory system that we know and understand. It's when, we learn how to structure giant bureaucracies. And so it's like, we built these institutions, like we built and codified basically these, the technical term is games, right? Games, not in the sense of entertaining sense, but games in the sense of like, I don't know, game theory or something. Right, where it's like we built these games, we built these systems that then people insert into. All right, and if I insert into a low level position at a giant company, I'm able to play this game over 30 years to rise up and become the CEO. If I enter as a low level diplomat in the UN, I'm able to rise up over time and become Secretary General. If I insert as a grad student in a university research lab, I'm able to rise up over time, to your point, and become a principal investigator and be running my own lab. Right, and then you've got at universities, you've got this whole you've got the journal game, right, with publications, right, and this weird thing where you get scored based on the journal articles that you publish in these journals that nobody can afford to buy, right, that nobody very few people read, but that's somehow how you get scored, and so or the tenure, right, the tenure track, and how you kind of navigate through that game, and so we put this set of games in place, and we put these games in place because we thought we were systematizing a way of achieving excellence, right? If you go back and you read the people in the 1920s, or like Vannevar Bush, like for example, is FDR's science advisor who kind of basically codified modern university research in the 40s. He thought that he's basically creating an optimized system for maximum output of high quality research. But it's the incentives problem to your point, which is basically, and anybody who knows the business knows this, which is like every time you define a metric, immediately people will start to game the metric. Right. And so if you tell me as a researcher in a university that I need to publish journal articles, right, I'm going to publish journal articles. Now, will anybody read them? Right. Will anybody cite them? Will anybody care? Like, do they actually move the field ahead? Maybe, maybe not. Right. and so forth and so on through all these different games. And so I think it's possible that like we spent as a society like 50 years kind of assembling these systems in these games, in the first half of the 20th century, and then we spent the last half of the 20th century basically gaming the games, right? And so and you see this just in the sense of like this sense of kind of these institutions going moribund, right? These institutions broadly that were created in the first half of the 20th century, just like generating worse and worse results. The response to worse and worse results is to fund them even more lavishly, right? And so you're sort of in this loop where they're headed in the wrong direction. And then, I would say finally, there's the sort of adverse selection component that I alluded to, and honestly, like in my day job, I really benefit from this, which is, a lot of our founders, right, are people who 50 or 75 or 100 years ago, I think would have stayed in academia, right, as an example, right, or I think they would have, worked in big businesses their whole lives, right, and so I think they might have, stayed at Stanford their whole life, or they might have stayed at IBM their whole life, or something like that. But now they just, if you're really like sharp and young and hungry and aggressive and ambitious, you look around you I hear this all the time, right? I hear this all the time from our founders is I looked around and what I saw was just like incredibly depressing. And I realized I had to get out of there, right? And I had to get into a position where I could build my own thing because I actually want to be part of a high performance environment that doesn't tolerate all this bullshit. And so, I guess I'd say everything I'm describing is kind of depressing from a societal standpoint, but it's the full employment act for what I do day to day. And look, maybe that's fair. Like maybe that's just where we're at. We could have a long conversation about this, but like, is it even worth trying to do institutional reform, at this point? Or is the correct answer just to build institutions, and venture capital startup formation is a way to build new institutions? This far from perfect, but like it seems to work quite well. And maybe we actually just need like a much more revolutionary mindset when it comes to trying to build new institutions.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. I mean, it does seem like we're just throwing more money at the problem. I mean, we just had a few infrastructure bills that are just massive by historical standards, and there seems to be a lot more interest in throwing money at infrastructure than there is figuring out why we have more difficulty building infrastructure at a reasonable price than any other country in the world. I think before you cut big checks for that, I think you'd want to figure that part out first. And so, yeah, I mean, when you talk about gaming the metrics, it's funny because sometimes I'll look at it seems like some fields are particularly bad at this. So I'll look at somebody who has like who's like a medical doctor, like a top research university, and I'll look at their Google Scholar. It makes it so convenient for you, and they'll have like a publication every 2 weeks. So like 30 publications in a year. They're one of 20 authors on each publication. It's just like, how carefully are you looking at each one of these papers? I don't know if this is real work, or you're just, shuffling paper around and, adding another line to your, to your CV. Yeah. So, I mean, how optimistic are you? There's ways things can get reformed. I mean, so like you think about the taxi drivers, right? So there was these people, they just bought these medallions. They had special rights. They could overcharge everybody, and that existed for a while. And that nobody passed a law that says, okay, anyone can become a taxi driver. What happened was Uber came around, and they actually violated the law in a lot of places, right? They weren't supposed to do what they did, right? The laws were there to protect the taxi drivers in place, but then they disrupted the industry. Now the industry is not doing so well. Something similar is happening with Airbnb. So when I think about the things that have been disrupted recently, it seems to be always a case of just technology coming along. And it's hard to think of, places in recent history where there was just a vested interest, it was powerful, and then we just passed a law or we passed a regulation and we opened things up. Is technology pretty much the only way to do this now, or can there be, something? Can we get something good through politics or regulations?
Yeah. So what you see, my experience is the closer you get to the government, like the closer you just get to like kind of seeing how the government operates in conjunction with any given industry. And you gave two great examples there, which is real estate and transportation. But we could have the exact same discussion about financial services. We could have the same discussion about healthcare, like many other topics. By the way, housing. Education for sure. The closer you get, basically what you see, and this is not a new observation. Like this is, James Burnham probably made this observation originally, and Joseph Schumpeter also talked about a fair amount in the 50s. But and then there's this whole field of public choice economics that talks about this. But basically, what you see on the ground is just regulatory capture, like over and over and over and over again. And it's actually interesting. What you actually see, I think, is you actually see kind of regulatory capture in both directions, which is the companies that gain power, the economic entities that gain power in these industries early. They capture their regulator, right? And so they capture the government regulator, and basically what they end up doing is they basically end up implementing regulations in their industry that have the effect of basically cementing their market positions in place and preventing new competition. And the taxi medallion example is a classic example of that. And that's sort of the classic definition of regulatory capture, right? Is the companies capturing the government. But you also see the other side of it kind of at the same time, which is you see the government capturing the companies, right? And the sort of this gets into maybe the Burnham part a little bit more, which is basically it's like I'll give you an example. Take the three big banks, right? So take J.P. Morgan Chase, Bank of America, and Citibank, right? In 2007, 2008, these were the quote too big to fail banks, right? And what everybody knew was the whole problem with the financial crisis is that the too big to fail banks are too big, and so the obvious right answer is like we can never tolerate having banks this big again because big banks mean systemic risk, and so therefore we have to make sure which is therefore require the bailouts, and so we have to make sure this never happens again. The regulatory reforms that followed, right, were codified in this bill called Dodd-Frank. The big banks like complained endlessly about how horrible Dodd-Frank was, but if you look at the results of Dodd-Frank, the issuance of new bank charters in the U.S. dropped to zero, and then the three too big to fail banks got much larger. Right, and this is after all of the work that Senator Warren and like all these incredibly smart and animated and fired up people did. Like the result is the too big to fail banks today are much larger and more systemically important than they were before. Like the problem has been like greatly increased. The exact problem that the regulations were supposed to shut off, and so you kind of say from that, okay, then it's regulatory capture. Like part of that is those companies which have giant regulatory machines, right? Literally tens of thousands of lawyers and compliance people and government, relations people and huge, political fundraising operations. Like part of that is they've captured the government. Part of that is like those banks are now effectively, I think, de facto, subunits of the Treasury Department, right? Like they are very tightly integrated into the government. The Treasury Department gets to basically tell them what to do on any given day. They have to do it. I think one way to think about those three banks is they're no longer independent companies per se. You could more think of them just as the U.S. Department of Banking, right? Like if they were simply government agencies, if they were simply departments in the executive branch, like would we experience anything differently in terms of market structure or customer service or anything?
What do you think they're doing on behalf of I understand what the banks are getting from the government. What's the government getting from the banks?
They can arbitrarily, they can arbitrarily control and manipulate the economy through the banks. This is, the way the Federal Reserve implements their activity is through the discount window through to the banks. They can implement, various kinds of political, social, and administrative policies. They can just, deplatforming, kicking people off the financial system. They can, the U.S. Sanctions regime, which, by the way, I'm in favor of from a national security standpoint. I'm in favor of, but the U.S. sanctions regime is implemented through the banks. Global development, all the global, foreign aid, all of the, the ability for the government to kind of wield financial soft power all over the world. A lot of that is run through these banks. And so it's basically like they're arms of state power. And again, like not even so much, you could take a critical view of this, but I don't even mean to be particularly critical. It's just like observationally, this is what and in fact, we saw this during the financial crisis itself, because like how was policy made during the financial crisis? It was literally like a handful of senior officials with a handful of bank CEOs sitting in a room and deciding what they were going to do, right? And there's that famous scene from the book and the movie, where all the bank CEOs are called to Washington and they're all basically told that they're all going to take federal bailouts. Right. And there's, some of the bank CEOs are like, basically, screw you. I'm not taking a bailout. I don't need one. And the Secretary of the Treasury at the time was like, nope, you're all taking them. And, sure enough, they all took them. And so it's a more direct level of control than I think people imagine. And again, I'm just picking banking as an example, right? It's like, if Harvard were the U.S. Department of, expertise, call it, would anything really change? If the Brookings Institute was the U.S. Department of Policy Analysis, would anything really change? Mm-hmm. If the New York Times was the U.S. Department of Information, would anything really change? Right. And I think over time, you can apply it to tech. If Google was the U.S. Department of Search, right? Like would anything really change? And the this is the this is kind of the Burnham argument, right? Which is the sort of regime is not just the formal government, right? The regime is what the regime is the broader kind of kind of elite holding power, and that's expressed across a combination of governmental and non-governmental entities, and then they end up getting very intertwined. That it's a little bit of a sort. Talk to any VC or any entrepreneur. This is a sore spot because like the way we experience this is just constantly kind of running up against this complex.
Yeah.
And so we have some for sure self-interest in pointing this out into hoping that over time it maybe gets a little bit less intense, but it's pretty intense.
Yeah, I think, with reform, you're always sort of pushing against the grain, and people have a status quo bias, and there's always, concentrated interests. And I just try to think historically, like when that sort of bias towards the status quo has been overcome. And it's usually, some kind of revolutionary ideology, like, the communists take over or ISIS or the Taliban takes over. And, they knock down all the institutions, pretty quickly. And better case, we think more positively of, decolonization. There has to be something that happens, right? There has to be sort of an external force that shakes things up. And, I think this is sort of what Curtis Yarvin gets at in his writings when he says, revolution is easier than reform. I guess the problem I see right now is there's I listen to the arguments of public choice theory and people who believe in cost benefit analysis, and they make perfect sense to me. I don't see anyone, ready to charge the barricades for those ideas. Is the problem is there's just no sort of revolutionary ideology that's going to spur people to just go and overcome whatever inertia there is in the system?
Well, so let me tell you what we do. So what we do is, I would say what we do is maybe a minor league version of what you're getting at, right? And this goes to your examples of like Uber and Airbnb. So what we do basically, I think about it basically as like we run basically just a continuous flow of like X-wing fighters up against the Death Star. Right. And so we are just and it's all of our startups. Like we're funding these very fired up entrepreneurs with these very, disruptive ideas. And I'll talk about disruption in a second because it's really critical here, the theory of disruption, which is often mischaracterized. But we fund like all these disruptive startups. We fund, I'll just give you an example today at our firm, we have over 250 companies currently in our portfolio that we own 10% or more of. Right. And so think of it as like basically 250 X-wing fighters. And they are running sorties against the Death Star, and by the way, we know statistically what's going to happen. It's very clear in the data, which is basically half of them are going to get blown up on impact. Like basically in top end venture capital, half the companies don't work, and so we're just going to lose half of them. And for a variety of reasons, like some of them are just going to they're going to screw things up or whatever, but part of it is they're going to hit the kind of hit deflector shields of various kinds and get blown up. And then, another quarter of them are going to generate kind of, okay, but not great returns, which is to say they're going to do something kind of interesting and some, useful, but not revolutionary. And so it's really only the top quartile of the companies that we fund that are going to kind of punch out and do something, really meaningful. So out of the 250, call that, whatever that number is, 70 or whatever, or 60. The dangers of doing math on the fly. And then, within that quartile, there's like an upper, whatever, God willing, upper 10% or whatever that are going to really kind of punch through, and are kind of, going to really have the potential to change things. And so, it's a high attrition rate, right? It's what do the social scientists say? Biologists say it's what's K selected, not R selected, right? And so, and look, our entrepreneurs, they all understand the nature of the challenge. They're all, these are all their plans, by the way. This isn't us putting them up to it. Like they're choosing to do this, and they take the best run they can. By the way, in a lot of cases, they may blow one up and they may come right back around and do another one, and we might fund that next one, right? So you do get, it's a game with multiple opportunities to play, which is great. And so, we just kind of get to run those. Those companies do, I think, exactly what you described in a lot of cases, which is they have to have some form of technological wedge. And I often kind of equate sort of technological wedge, economic wedge, kind of go hand in hand, but they need to have some kind of technological wedge. Like they need to have some claim that there's a technology change, and you gave two examples of this, Uber and Airbnb. It's both like, okay, now that we have the web and now that we have, mobile phones and we have GPS and we have online, payments and so forth and online reputation systems, now all of a sudden we can do, driver rider matching in cars, or we can do, housing guest matching in homes. in a completely different way, which was never possible before, basically smartphones and GPS and all these other technologies. And so our startups need to have this wedge to have a chance to kind of punch through. But then the other thing they do is, they are quote unquote disruptive, and this word disruptive has gotten kind of a bad knock, because it sounds bad, right? Disruption sounds bad. It sounds like, oh, something was working and now it's going to get disrupted and now it's going to get worse. But the reason we use the term disruption is because Clay Christensen, who wrote the book, The Innovator's Dilemma, that kind of talks about this. He kind of chose that word. And the key thing in there that's very important to keep in mind is disruption of the form that our companies do it only works if consumers like it, right? Uber only works, right, if drivers want to drive for it and if riders want to ride on it, right? Airbnb only works if people who own homes want to list, their homes or rooms in their homes on Airbnb, and only if guests want to stay in those homes. It's all, everything we do by definition, it's purely optional, right? People could just keep doing what they do. They don't have to change anything, right? Or they could try this new thing. And so I think that the argument I would make that what we do is kind of a minor form of the kind of revolutionary change you're talking about is it's basically we couple this idea of sort of technological wedge into the market, coupled with real consumer choice. Right. And then I would say finally you kind of couple it with this sort of the old I think Victor Hugo, was it one of those guys who said there's nothing so powerful as an idea whose time has come. Like at some point it just gets obvious that there's a better way to do things. There was a famous, Uber's not one of our companies, but we were involved in Lyft, which is kind of the other very successful company in the space. But Uber had this very clever strategy we found out about later. This very clever strategy, which is, they would go insert into a city, and they, as you said, they were like nominally in violation of the whatever taxi limo regulations in the city. So what they would do is they would focus on having a high amount of supply, which is to say a lot of cars and drivers sort of on standby within a couple minutes of City Hall. Right. And so they would have this thing where if you were a staffer in City Hall or if you were a city council person in City Hall, you could be, sitting in the chamber, during the afternoon, fulminating against these, evil Silicon Valley people doing this, that, and the other thing. And then you could go right outside and punch into your Uber app and get a ride in 30 seconds. And, the driver would happily take you home. Right. And if it wasn't you doing that, it was your young staff doing that, or it was your kids doing that. Right. And so, and at some point, this actually surfaced during AOC's campaign, where she was, fulminating against the gig economy. And it turned out, of course, she and her campaign were like big users of Uber. Right. Yeah. Right. And so at some point, it's just like, this is what caused Uber and Lyft to work, is at some point, it's just like, well, just obviously this is better. Like, obviously, right? It's better for everybody. Airbnb, obviously it's better, right? Hotels still exist. You can still stay in a hotel. People, a very large number of people overwhelmingly prefer to stay in Airbnb. It's a better experience. And then, overwhelmingly people who list on Airbnb are doing it because they either want to have a business on the side or because they're using it to help cover their house payments or because it's a fun thing for them to do. And it's something that they're voluntarily choosing to do. And so anyway, as I say, this is the light version of revolution, but at least it's not pinning your hopes on kind of these endless dreams of reform that, at least in my view, seem to never materialize.
Yeah, I mean, so isn't that, I think about Peter Thiel's distinction between, the world of bits and the world of atoms, and we've been making progress in the world of bits, but, not the world of atoms. And is this sort of revolutionary strategy, is it limited to stuff that can be solved through bits and software? Because, the recent examples tend to be things like Airbnb, something that, that can be solved. Just, computers are always getting better. They're getting cheaper. They're faster. Mobile devices, all of that. But if you go in if you traffic, right, you just want to drive somewhere and you want your commute to work, that's not getting better. That's staying the same or getting worse. Travel at the airports is getting worse, right? And so there's these places that are just, it seems like you can revolutionize in the way of software when there is a software solution to something. I guess the question is, what do we do for the large portion of things in the world that are problems that can't be solved in a similar way? We have to overcome the regulation some way or the other.
Yeah, so there's a part of what Peter says that I really agree with, and what you're saying that I really agree with, and I'll come back to that. But let me start with the part that I agree with a little bit less, which is there isn't, what you find is there really isn't this like clear demarcation between bits and atoms anymore. And I would argue that Uber and Airbnb are actually great examples of this. Like Uber is a software, like yes, the company Uber builds and runs a software app, but and things happen in that software app. When things happen in that software app, they directly affect the distribution of bits in the real world, or sorry, of atoms in the real world, right? And so, and if you think about this, there's a magic to this. Think about it as follows, which is there's a programmer at Uber who's typing in code right now, right? When he punches enter, all of a sudden, right, hundreds of thousands of cars today are going to drive to places that they would not have otherwise driven, right? And hundreds of thousands of drivers are going to drive and pick up passengers they never would have picked up before. And those are, the drivers and the cars and the passengers are all made of atoms, right? Right. And so you have this kind of sort of, sort of like software controlling the world in a lot of ways, right? Like you have code that then directly expresses itself in the real world and causes the real world of atoms to reorganize. And obviously Airbnb is another example of that. And you mentioned traffic, and you mentioned traffic as an example. Like, look, the one of the solutions to traffic ultimately is autonomy and having, much more intelligent kind of navigation and kind of, good, kind of comprehensive, kind of system of determining who goes where and when and how to best optimize for that. And look, a self-driving car is, it's a lot of software, but it's still, whatever, 4,000 pounds of steel and glass and rubber. And it is going to go different places based on what the software says, and the distribution of traffic is going to change based on what the software says, and as a consequence, things like rush hour are going to change. And so, I guess the more kind of optimistic view is we have software not just as this tool to just build software. We have this basically software, which is like this magic ability to kind of do things in thin air, if you will, in the world of bits that actually then affect the world of atoms. We could have a huge discussion like this is playing out in warfare, right? Military strategy all over the place. It's playing out in lots of industries. Let me give you an example of. Let me just give you kind of an example of a company. Let's see. Actually, I probably shouldn't give that example. There are a lot of examples of companies that we have that I could go on at length about where they're doing something in software, but the ability to kind of translate into real world activity is, I think, fundamentally greater than people think. And then I would make one more claim, which is like increasingly what we see is software that literally replaces the need, right, for bits for atoms, right? And so the great example there is this just massive kind of shove towards video conferencing that's taken place in the last year and a half, right? Which is as you said, like software hasn't eaten the airplane in like a literal sense, in that airplanes contain a lot of software, but it's still fundamentally a physical object. But if I can do a super high quality internet based video experience, or be part of a virtual conference, and therefore substitute for an actual real world trip with a real world plane that I now don't need to take, like it's a direct substitution. And so I think that's another way you kind of get this effect. Having said all that, I do still agree with the larger point. We kind of have an unfair advantage of disrupting through software, and it's just because like software is inherently so malleable, right? It's just like software is fundamentally somebody sitting in front of a keyboard and like typing something in, and then kind of magical things happen. The world of atoms is obviously not like that. So we just have this, we basically we have this kind of magic, kind of tool in the world of bits that we don't have in the world of atoms. And then we could get into this long discussion about like what would be required to apply these same principles in the world of atoms. We do a lot. We do have a lot of activities. We do fund companies that go straight after the world of atoms. I would say it's just significantly harder. And I think most of those questions very rapidly become societal questions, right? Which is, of course, the hard ones, which is like, what do we want, right? Like, how much change do we want? Like, what is the rate of like incumbent lock-in versus disruption that we actually want? What is the level of, government regulatory capture intertwining with oligopolies that we actually want? And just observationally as a society, we seem to want a fair amount of that right now. And honestly, like, I don't know that I'm in a position to really change that. So I think people like me are primarily reacting to that as opposed to actually really changing that very much.
Yeah, you talked about software sort of having this unfair advantage, and I think it's just not inherent to the product, but it's also inherent to our regulatory environment, right? They talk about the Zoom replacing the airplane. a huge consideration for me on whether I take a flight is just how inconvenient air travel has gotten. Right, most of the time, time spent in the time spent in the air is a minority of the time that it takes to travel somewhere. Right, you've got to go through security, you got to get there a few hours early, you got to wait for the delay, you got to wait for your car. It's just not it's not very good, and it's getting worse. It's gotten worse since 9/11. It's some places the airport's now the only place you have to wear masks. I don't know if that's ever going away. So there's just a lot of things now that make air travel uncomfortable. So of course Zoom will eat its lunch when Zoom is allowed to exist and get better, while air travel is not. Maybe it's just harder to make air travel better, but I feel that a lot of it is clearly regulations. Yeah. So
Let me hit one thing on the air travel. So here's another thing to think about. So you think about the policy issues. So immigration. And this is not a statement on like immigration pro or con or whatever, just like observing that this is like obviously this is like a big societal, political, policy issue in the current world. And so, traditionally, if I wanted to work at a company in another country, I would have to go to that country, right? And I would have to be an immigrant from my country and an immigrant, at least for a while into the other country. In a world of remote work and Zoom and Slack and every other online system we have now for doing remote work via software, I can now work for people anywhere in the world can work for at least companies doing any kind of knowledge work, right? And it's just like immigration policies apply to the atoms of the human being; they don't apply to the bits, right? And so I can go to work for some other company anywhere in the world. I can just work there. I can if it's a remote first country or a remote friendly company in whatever country that is, I'm a fully integrated employee. I may never travel there. I may never have to travel there. And it's like one way of interpreting that is basically this world of bits increasingly makes, for example, immigration policy just like a completely like a much less interesting topic. Or let's just say it makes immigration policy much less powerful in terms of actually restricting the flow of quote unquote people. Because even though I may not be able to physically enter, virtually I can and I do, and I have and I will, and I can basically live my life in this other country virtually, at least from an economic standpoint. And so, on the one hand, maybe you could say like immigration policy is, increasingly moot, as compared to the ability for people to kind of virtually travel over bits. Another way you could look at it is you could say, well, actually, like maybe this really takes the edge off, the need for immigration. Maybe this actually reduces the salience of the entire issue in a very positive way, which is maybe a lot of people will be much happier actually staying in their home countries and not wanting to immigrate to some other place because now they won't have to. So maybe the demand for immigration actually falls, right? And it just becomes a less salient issue because people can get what they want economically over the internet. And they can continue to live in their home countries and be part of their local culture and their family, and not have to make the kind of harsh trade-offs that a lot of migrants historically have had to make. And I feel like, and I guess I feel like we're on the very front end of even conceptualizing that this is now a choice. That these are actually viable scenarios. But I think they actually now are for a lot of people.
Yeah. Okay. So to turn the topic, to shift the topic a little bit, I was interested in this, interview you did with a guy. I think his name is Nicholas Soldo.
Yep.
What struck me about the interview and what made, I think, your take different from most takes of most people I read is that you're a big techno optimist. And so when we talk about tech in sort of the political realm now, there's sort of I think a left wing critique and a right wing critique, although sometimes they blend together. But I think the left wing critique is about income inequality and AOC's criticism of the gig economy. I think there's there. I find that critique less convincing and less interesting. It sort of sounds like the same mistake that Luddites people have been making against technology since the beginning of time. So I don't find that very convincing. But there's also a right wing critique that I think is a little more interesting, and the idea is sort of we are becoming weird and antisocial thanks to that there's this addiction element. I don't like the medicalized terminology, but basically our screens bring us a lot of joy in the immediate short term, and we're not doing things that previous generations did. We're not going to play outside as much. I don't know about I'm talking more like the younger generation. They're not going outside. They're not developing social skills. They're not becoming, they're not becoming resilient. And people will point to stuff like showing increasing rates of depression, mental illness. People like Jonathan Haidt, the last 10, 15 years. I think Haidt and Lukanoff, they blame it on the cell phone and the kids getting smartphones. So there's this, cultural critique of technology and what's it doing to to us. I'm a little bit sympathetic to it, but my impression from reading what you write and reading your interviews is that you're much more optimistic. So can you give sort of the optimistic take for technology and what it's doing to our brains?
Yeah, so let me frame the overall dynamic you described, which is the left wing and right wing critiques, and then we'll get into the specifics. So economist Brian Kaplan famously does, he has a long term exercise to try to distill down the sort of partisan differences between left and right to the sort of most parsimonious explanation, and he finally came up with one a few years ago that I think about a lot, which is he said the core principle of the left is the left hates markets. Right, and so like the left hates markets, and they hate markets, of course, because markets generate inequality. Markets surface, markets surface what things are actually valued. Markets surface who actually produces a lot, and so markets just naturally generate inequality, and so therefore the left hates markets. And then he says that the right, the main principle of the right is the right hates the left. Right. And so, right. And, this is the old Buckley thing of, the role of conservatism is to stand athwart history, with a capital H and yell stop. Right. Which is like basically from the right, you view as like, OK, all of the societal changes happening around us are all being driven from the left. They're all driving things further to the left. They're all, leading societies in the directions that the left thinks that things should go, and that those things are bad because they're, against tradition and they're against history. They're against the way that things have always worked, and the things that have, in their view, been proven, and so therefore, those things are bad. And so I think technology gets kind of, in my view, kind of trapped up in this dynamic. So therefore, to your point, like the left hates technology because they hate capitalism. They hate capitalism because they hate markets. They hate markets because the markets are inegalitarian. And so there's, we just kind of slot naturally into that critique. And then the right hates technology because it seems like technology is a tool of the left, right? In the sense of like whatever societal changes are happening kind of, basically through technology, right? Because, look, technology does change human behavior. Like technology does change how societies work. It always has. It may be the main thing. It may be the main thing that does. And so, to the extent that that's true, then, whatever societal changes are probably happening either as a consequence of technology or at least through technology. Those are changes generally that the left is in favor of and the right is opposed to. So I think we're kind of in like, I think in a lot of ways we are I think about this a lot, like we are the perfect thing. We are like hyper like evolved to be the thing that's maximally hated by both sides. Which is actually, quite an interesting position to be in. So anyway, so we could talk about that, but yeah. So the specific critique. So I guess the question is, is the question. Let me actually clarify the question. Is the question a very specific question of like, is technology changing how we operate as human beings, or is it a broader question on social change?
Well, I mean, it's both. Is there something to the critique that what technology is doing to our brains has a bad psychological effect, and anything that has a bad psychological effect on a mass scale will obviously have a negative social effect. So, I mean, do you find that critique convincing at all?
Yeah. So, I guess there's a couple things. So one is, it's important that, I would say there's maybe a tendency to just be flat out ahistorical. Let me defend technology for a minute, and then maybe we'll come back to maybe a little bit more of the case of the prosecution. So one is there's like an ahistorical component to the kind of these discussions generally, which is basically, it's like, I'll give you an example. Like technology is causing political radicalization. Like technology is causing people to believe in all these kind of cultish, like, political, kind of movements, causing people to radicalize politically. And it's like, well, okay, the problem though is that like both communism and Nazism like predated the internet, right? Like, like say what you will about Hitler, like he didn't use the internet.
Yeah.
Right, like Nazism like did pretty well as a crazy, insane, psychotic political philosophy that was adopted by a lot of people and had like major catastrophic consequences, like without the internet. In fact, basically like radio, right, was the thing. Communism swept the globe, and communism was, again, it was sort of entirely pre-internet. In fact, the internet didn't really take off until right around
I think this ideological thing. Yeah, I think you're right. I think people talk about, oh my God, the misinformation and the rise of white supremacy because of online. Yeah, I don't find that very convincing. What about the psychological thing that people are becoming sort of brittle and that they're becoming more anxious and they're just not like being a human. They're not just going out there. When I was a kid, I feel lucky because I'm just old enough to, I was in the internet. I grew up before social media. I think the internet. I first discovered message boards maybe when I was in 9th or 10th grade. I had a flip phone. I think by 11th grade, and so I was grew up in this time where I remember the pre-internet world. And my life revolved around, hanging out with other people, calling them on the phone, trying to find girls to go out with me, getting into fights with guys. And, all of these things are, some of these things are healthy. Some of these things are not healthy, getting in trouble sometimes. But, I felt like the entire time I was sort of, I felt like I was improving socially. I was sort of finding my way in the world. And I don't know if and I think I was growing up, I had a bit of social anxiety and I had a little bit of social awkwardness and, the socializing didn't really come natural to me. And I think that it took a lot of sort of, getting rejected, getting made fun of, getting beat up to sort of, become somebody better. And I don't know, like if I was born today, right, or born 10 years ago, I could have done all of that digitally, right? So yeah, and so I think about my own life, and I think about this sort of remembering the pre-internet world and the post-internet and post-smartphones and social media world, and I think about the sort of the political ideologies. They're not communism or Nazism, but the things that take it over just seem to be very self-centered, and they seem to be consistent with this idea that people are becoming more brittle and less able to deal with real challenges. And I do wonder, is this making us worse psychologically? Is that the effect of social media, the internet, our smartphones?
Well, so I remember the pre-internet world a little bit differently. So this is the other part. This is it's wonder about the rose-colored glasses kind of component to this. So, and of course, we all have our own experiences, and so I don't mean to question yours, but I remember the pre-internet world very differently. Which is I remember. So I grew up in the Midwest in the '70s and '80s, and I remember basically nonstop moral panics in the opposite direction. And this I find very amusing over the last several years because it's like, boy, everything that they told me to freak out about in the '70s and '80s now apparently we're supposed to miss, and wish we had more of, which is like, the idea of like kids, like as an example, like dating and having sex, where I grew up in the '70s and '80s was like a major constant source of moral panic. Yeah. Right. And it was literally up to and including like all the kids are going to die because they're all going to get AIDS.
Yeah.
Right. If you have sex, you're going to get AIDS. If you're a straight person, you have sex, you're going to get AIDS, you're going to die. Right. And so like it's a death sentence for teenagers who have premarital sex. Right. I mean, that was like a serious panic. There was also a very serious panic about child kidnappings. I sort of grew up in the full flush of the satanic panic. And so it was literally this thing of, there were going to be, on any given day, if you went and played outside, you were going to get like snatched off the street by the creepy guy in the van and never be heard from again. And all these kids getting, kind of abused and vanished, kind of through these things. It was just like nonstop panic kind of every step of the way. That basically whatever kids were doing was like bad and horrible and dangerous and likely to lead to and then of course it was all of the panic, kind of flowing out of the revolutionary changes of the '60s. And so, it's heavy, I know where I grew up is like, heavy metal music is like a tool of Satan, right? Like, and heavy metal music is going to like seriously, like permanently, like, make this entire generation of kids like deeply like immoral and wicked, right? And like, if you listen to heavy metal music today, it's like, oh, that's quaint. That's kind of cute.
Yeah.
And of course that moral panic then got immediately transplanted onto hip hop. And then if you kind of go back further in history, like I think what you find over and over again is basically those kinds of moral panics, right? There's this great Twitter account called Pessimist Arc where these guys kind of go back and document all this stuff. But like, there was this gigantic moral panic in the late 1800s around the bicycle, right? And this idea that kids were going to be able to like, range from village to village without adult supervision. And of course, they were all going to get sex and, have children out of wedlock and get STDs and die. There was moral panic about radio. There was moral panic about, paperback novels. There was moral panic in the '50s about comic books. And so there is this like in any given generation, basically whatever the kids are doing is just like the worst thing that's ever happened, and it's going to lead to like certain doom, destruction, and the collapse of Western civilization. So anyway, so like I don't. It was far from at least where I grew up. It was not nearly as idyllic as I think people as I hear people describe. Maybe people had more idyllic experiences. Look, having said that, now let me argue a little bit more on the case for the prosecution, which is say technology to some extent, I think, as you've been discussing, like it drives I would certainly concede like technology is certainly capable of driving psychological change. We could talk about like I think there's a whole actually future frontier of neurochemistry that's going to get very important as we try to actually kind of fully understand this, which we still don't very well in the science right now. But yeah, it's capable. Technology is for sure capable of driving psychological change. I think that's almost certainly true. It's certainly capable of driving sociological change. But then you've also got this like this old question of like, is it an engine or is it a camera? Like, or put it this way, is it a cause or is it a mechanism? Right? Like, I'll give you an example. Is social media a cause of behavioral changes among teenagers that would not be happening if not for the technology, or is the technology simply the method that those psychological changes are instantiating themselves, right, and transmitting? Right. And so I'll just give you an example. As you know, like the 1960s kicked off like, this incredible kind of, this sort of sexual revolution, this revolution of sexual mores, this revolution in, gender dynamics between men and women, this, entire revolution of like, acceptance of homosexuality and then all the, kind of things. The so-called sex change operation started around that time. And that, of course, has become trans. Right, the enabler for the trans movement, and like those things all started like 30 years, 40 years before the internet. And so the internet shows up kind of 30 or 40 years into those things, and then those things, like, look, at the very least, those behaviors and those changes and those principles and those movements, for sure, then basically travel through the internet and are enabled by the internet, right, and are spread via the internet. Good or bad or indifferent or whatever, like, for sure that's true. Were they caused by the internet, right? In the counterfactual, had the internet not emerged, would these social and behavioral changes be happening anyway? Or would they just simply be happening through the older technologies? Would they be happening through television and radio and newspapers and, comic books and novels and all the other movies and all the other media that they were already happening through from the 60s through the 90s? I think quite possibly. And so I guess what I would propose is it's probably a more complex interrelationship where technology is probably somewhat an engine, right, of a driver of change. It's somewhat a camera, which is just a way for us to actually see the change. It's somewhat like an enabling mechanism, or sort of a conduit. It's kind of a blend of those three, and I think it's actually quite hard to disentangle those.
Yeah, I think that's fair enough. There's some trends you can see that just start online, and you can't imagine them coming, from anywhere else. There's a term now, demisexual, where apparently the kids say, if you want, this is just, if you need to have a personal connection with someone to have sexual attraction to them, and the joke on social media is like, that's just being a girl, right? And people trace this to like a Tumblr account, right? Would that have like made its way into a novel and maybe taken off in the same way? Maybe, I don't know, but it seems like some of these crazy things can be directly traced to the internet.
Well, let me give you an example. Here's something I think about in a related kind of way that maybe would apply back to this, which is, I think people forget how boring things were before the internet. Like, it's like, here's my people really like to be into things. Like, people like to have a thing, right? That people like to have something that's like not just like go to work, come home, collapse on the couch, go to work the next day, take whatever, change the baby's diaper, today change the baby's diaper tomorrow. Like, people like to have a thing, right? And once upon, if you go back thousands of years, the thing was the gods of the tribe and the family of the tribe and the sort of whatever cult you were in as part of being a part of a family or a tribe or a city. If you progress through to the last 2,000 years, it's the big religions. People got super into Protestantism and Catholicism and Judaism and Islam and so forth. And then the rise of mass media, they got super into movies and entertainment and music and all kinds of things. And then some level of sort of fringe political movements or actual cults. People got super into Scientology or something like that. But like, they were kind of these big movements, and kind of a lot of other people were in them, and it was never that distinctive and unique and original to be I don't know, Catholic, or something like that, right? It wasn't it was a marker of identity, but it wasn't like a marker of uniqueness in the way that kind of modern man maybe looks for. And so there used to be a term for activities that people would do to pass the time before the internet. That term's almost completely died, and the term is hobby, right? Like, people used to have hobbies, right? And so when I was a kid, it was like, well, what do you do when you get home from, you go to work, whatever, you get home, you go to school, you get home, you have a hobby. And it's like, and if you remember what hobbies were like when I was a kid, it was like stamp collecting, right? And it was like coin collecting.
Right.
It was like ham radio, right? And it was like, I don't know, whatever, woodworking, right? And it's just like, and like, I don't know, maybe there were a few people who were like super into woodworking or super into like stamp collecting, but like, I went through my phases and all these things. And after the first like couple months, it's just like, okay, it's a bunch of stamps in a book. Like, this is boring. I'm on to the next one. Like the internet, I think, has just like killed hobbies. Like, they're just dead. Like, they're just all dead. They're gone. The concept doesn't even exist. It's actually funny. The concept of having a hobby died at the exact same time as the concept of quote unquote going online, right? Which is a phrase that you heard constantly from like 1994 to like 2005. You get home at night and you go online, right? And the big internet company in the 90s was America Online, right? So it's like a big deal. America's going to go online. And then, starting in like the mid 2000s, it's like people stopped going online. Why did they stop going online? Because we're online all the time, right? The idea of not being online is now the weird thing, right? And so hobbies died when everybody went online. And so it's like, okay, what replaced hobbies, right? And of course, to your point, what replaced hobbies basically, I think, is basically internet movements, right? Internet community. Let's say the benign way to put it would be internet communities. The somewhat more intense way to put it would be internet cults. Right. And so now what are people into? They're not into stamp collecting or coin collecting. They're in, and they're into, they're into, socialism, right? Online, or they're into MAGA, or they're into QAnon, or they're into, the Trump Russia conspiracy, or they're into Bitcoin, or they're into, Elon, or they're into,
That sounds awful. That sounds like being into MAGA, QAnon, or wokeness and Russiagate instead of stamp collecting. Is that an improvement?
Oh yeah. But like literally, I think there's a big. I think actually that I would actually say like literally that's what's happened. And I say, look, you could paint a picture of that says that's horrible. These are destructive things, and like this is these things everybody's being driven crazy and all this stuff. You could also say it's not boring. Like, things were pretty boring. Like, things were pretty dull. Right, and in fact, you could actually this would be a right wing argument, right? Like, the right wing argument is right. The right wing, one of the right wing arguments, right, is man is not meant to simply be, man is not simply meant to be an atomized economic function, right? Man is not optimized to just literally be like a drone, and to just kind of drift along on, kind of the sort of, kind of waves of history, and to not, have sort of a principled position on which to stand, and not have a sense of identity, for something that's just greater than himself, and to not have a, a sense of a connection to community and to family and to society and all these things. And, a right wing critique of, quote unquote, neoliberalism is that it, atomizes society and kind of renders everything, basically dull and bland and, kind of gray, right? It's a Nietzschean concept of the last man, or, the new right calls the bug man. And like, okay, so, what's the opposite of the bug man, right? It's like somebody who's like fully engaged and energized. Right. And of course, what are they engaged and energized in? What is the ultimate thing to be energized about? It's capital H history, right? Like, it's like, okay, like the actual future unfolding of human events. And so, none of us like all of these different movements, but like, at least people are into things that are a lot more stimulating and arguably important than stamp collecting. And, so I don't know, like, well, here's the other thing, like, here's the other question, right? Which I think about a lot, which is, okay, if you sort of buy into everything I just said, view it good, bad, or indifferent, you could kind of say it is new, right? Like, so it feels to me like I don't know what you want to call it, like the global nervous system has like woken up, in the last like 10 or 15 years in a way that it hadn't before. Like, people just feel like a lot more, I don't know, energized. People feel a lot more, again, good or bad, energized, agitated, whatever you want to call it. Like, people are just like, there's an electricity in the air that is new. And look, maybe this is the beginning. Maybe this all just like intensifies for the rest of our lives, or maybe this is just us getting used to a new way of living. And 5 or 10 years from now, we're going to look back and we're going to say, okay, things went a little bit crazy there for a while, but now we actually know how to harness this new technology and have it be in our lives without it driving us all nuts. And I don't know the answer to that question, but I think it's a big question.
Yeah, I think the right wing, I think the right wing answer to that is not that the alternative to these internet cults is stamp collecting, right? I think the alternative that a lot of people think we've gotten away from is finding partners, getting married, having children. I sort of think that that's something you do when you're when you're bored. Maybe people say, "Oh, I don't want to have kids." I want to travel, and it's a different kind of fulfillment. If you're looking for pure excitement, maybe travel makes more sense than children. But I think a lot of people, especially on the political right, would say it's better for society and it's better overall, even for you, to make the choice of being boring, right? Settling down, having that family, and if you're just getting excited by capital H history all day, and not passing out your genes and dying a virgin, I think a lot of people are sort of horrified by that possibility, right? It's not just about replacing stamp collecting with threat, trolling people on Twitter. I think we might be losing something more important and fundamental.
Well, let me give you a case for optimism here from another direction. To your argument, let me give you a case for optimism to your exact argument here, which is how the post-COVID world might be different, right? Which is basically like as follows, which is like a big reason for the kind of whatever neoliberal atomization of society, right? Historically, has been this economic driver, where if you're a young and ambitious person and you want to have a career, and you want to kind of experience, the sort of exciting things, and you want to like pursue interesting, fields and whatever, but you grew up in a small town or a medium-sized town or someplace, or maybe a country where it's not the kind of where all the action is. For thousands of years, the answer has been you move to a city, right? And generally speaking, you move, the bigger the city, the better. And over the fullness of time, that led to this concept of these superstar cities, right? So the Bay Area or Los Angeles or New York or, whatever, Hong Kong or these sort of really big spectacular cities. And generally, as a young person, if you want to engage in all these exciting things, like, that's what you did. And then again, using your right wing argument, is that that therefore was like the disassembly of the extended family, right? And then the sort of creation of this idea of the nuclear family, right, which is a very kind of ahistorical concept. And then you have these, you have basically these fractured communities. And by the way, you also had like the consequences of adverse selection, right, as a result, which is like why are a lot of small towns in so much trouble? One argument is because all of the really kind of highly ambitious, highly capable people left, right? Because they left for better opportunities, right? And you could even argue this at a national level. Why are certain countries, for example, in the EU, doing much worse than others? And some of it is just simply the flow of the young, talented people. If you grew up in one of the small peripheral countries, you probably went to one of the bigger countries, to kind of realize your professional aspirations, or to be around people who are more like you, because you literally had to leave, and you had to go do that. Well, that was all pre-COVID. That was all pre-Zoom, right? That was all pre-internet, right? That was all pre-remote work. And so I think there's a real possibility. Catherine Boyle wrote a fantastic piece on this a couple months ago that I really recommended. But there's like a real possibility here that people can now actually decouple these decisions, so they can decouple basically where they work from where they live. But at a more fundamental level, maybe they don't have to make the same trade-off. They don't have to make the same trade-off kind of at all. In the extreme case, which is I can continue to live in a place where, maybe I'm with my extended family. Maybe it's a place where it's actually, by the way, I could afford to buy a house, right? It's a place where I could actually afford to be part of like a more traditional community. Maybe it's actually a place where I can be around more people who are like me from a religious standpoint or philosophical standpoint or political standpoint, right? I could be part of a community of people who are, co-religionists, which is also an idea that really fractured. And I can have sort of a thriving personal life that has more of, let's say, the traditional values that you're arguing in favor of. But because I now have the internet, I also have access to all of the excitement and all of the employment opportunities and all of the chance to interact with interesting people, and I can do all those things through the screen, right? And so it could be that this technology is going to unlock this new way of living. It's going to kind of be the best of both worlds.
Yeah, that's interesting. You made me think, about, I don't know how much you've been paying attention to what China's doing with trying to improve the birth rate, but they just removed the 2-child limit, right? They put it at a 3-child limit, and it's not that simple because they're sort of doing a more holistic sort of policy approach. So, for example, they're going after the tech education sort of tutoring industry on the grounds that it makes parenting expensive. It plays on the fears of parents. So they just wiped out a lot of market value of all their biggest companies, and they're focusing on stuff like housing. Even the propaganda is in line about families and children for the nation. So you have this sort of centralized approach, and I'm not saying that's good or bad, but it's an approach that I think is interesting to sort of look at and see if that works, or if you're just pushing against the grain of technology and it doesn't work. And maybe with remote work, we sort of get the same thing through decentralized means, right? We're doing a different kind of experiment, and that could potentially be a benefit of work from home. I think you're right on that's an interesting possibility. Yeah. I want to go back to something you said before. It was you're saying we're at this place where we're sort of ideal to be hated by the right and the left, and I thought a little bit about that. I think that is it just it's sort of human nature, right? So when you wrote your article about software eating the world, so sort of look at it this way. I mean, if like you bring up the example of Netflix, which is a really really cool product, right? You have an unlimited number of shows and movies. It's very convenient. The software works great. You can sit there on your screen on your device on your phone. You can watch whatever you want as long as you want. It's affordable. It's great. And that's a great accomplishment, but people don't really feel it in the same way. So like I was thinking of like if you had an alternative an alternative world where instead of Netflix, you invented like this transporting tube, right? That you sometimes see in science fiction, where they would just take you straight to the movie theater, right? Or something like that. That wouldn't be as good as Netflix, right? The selection would still be lower. You'd have to get there on time. You couldn't be in the comfort of your own home. But I think people would be grateful for that, and they would see that as a great innovation. While sort of this idea that it just sort of comes to your house that easily, it doesn't feel like progress, right? It feels like just more convenience, and we sort of have enough of that. Does the sort of I think a lot of these things can be made to feel, like progress. Like I think, if you told someone 20 years ago you had an iPhone and you could sit there and you could have all the information in the world literally a second away, right? I mean, I think people would have been impressed by that, but I just think people don't feel it in their bones the way they feel some kind of change in atoms. Is this a problem that sort of tech is hard to sell just because it's not romantic? It doesn't speak to something like within us, which wants to see planes flying and cars going really fast and just things out there in the real world.
Well, the numbers say the opposite, right? You just look at the Netflix usage numbers, and like clearly people love it because they're using it all the time, right? And by the way, the same thing is true for all these other things. Like, and if anything, the correlation is the more criticism something is getting, the more people actually like it, and the more they're using it.
Yeah.
Right. And so it's and all these technologies are actually interesting in that like we actually know the numbers. Like we know how many people use these things, like down to the click. Right. We know exactly what they do on these services. By the way, one of the things you get when you're on the inside of these companies is you get to actually see the results of scandals playing out in actual user behavior, right? And so you'll have one of these companies that'll have like a privacy scandal, or it'll have our company Robinhood went through this, right? They had this scandal, this whole thing around GameStop, and when they, for various reasons, there was the interruptions in trading. There'll be these huge kind of freak out moments where everybody will just get absolutely furious, and then you'll look at the numbers, and it's just the numbers are just all up and to the right. It's just
right.
like you'll just
aren't a lot of things are like that. Like I'm not saying tech is like pornography, but pornography is certainly like that, right? Where everyone likes it, but if you talk about everyone likes it. Everyone if the numbers are a lot of people watch it. But, if you talk about it politically or whether you think it's good for society, I think most people say it's not. And so the question is, do we brush aside that like, okay, just let's look at what people do. Let's not look at what people say, right? That's just cheap talk. Like, we could just discount that. Or does it indicate a real problem, right? I mean, I think that's the question.
Well, but it's also, it could be a real problem for society, but it's also a real problem then to figure out what to do about that, right? Because then what you're basically saying is, okay, people are exercising choice. And look, you can blame it on blame chemistry or dopamine or whatever, but like people are making a choice. There's no gun to somebody's head, to force them to do any of these things. These businesses would be a lot easier if you could force people to use them. I can tell you can't. And so, then what you've got is a very large number of people, for the big services, you've got hundreds of millions or billions of people who are exercising, at least some element of free choice to do these things. You can see in the data that they're incredibly highly engaged. You can see in the data that the scandals, if anything, just cause people to use them more. And yet you're going to have this the challenge then is you're going to have this top-down view that this is bad. And so therefore, X, and when X translates into something that is a kneecapping or a denial or a restriction, right? Now you're in territory where you're telling. I mean, you're fundamentally in prohibition territory, right? Like you're telling people, like, okay, I know you like beer, but like we're all going to stop drinking because it'll be better for society.
Yeah, but
right?
everyone has something. Like very few people will say legalize all hard drugs, right? Very few people will say, maybe you do, but a lot of libertarians will bite that bullet and say whatever choice is good. But everyone sort of draws a line somewhere, right? So it's not that crazy to say that about tech compared to anything else.
Yeah, look, I mean, there are, it's obviously there are, so there's all the, there's all the speech debates, right, about, free speech debates that apply to like the social networks, for example. But like, look, it doesn't matter how free speech somebody is. People are not going to be in favor of terrorist, actual terrorist recruitment. They're not going to be in favor of like actual, like, whatever white nationalist, sort of violent movements. There are, they're not going to be in favor of child porn. Like there are always restrictions. And so, obviously, then there's a big dispute to have to where to draw those lines. But let me go back to your Netflix thing, though, which again, it goes to this consumer choice thing, which is you postulated the existence of like this magical movie theater experience that would maybe be like more special when in person and have these other attributes.
Well, I mean, it might or might not make people happier in the moment. But politically, people would feel like that was a great accomplishment in the way they Netflix. And whether maybe it would be a better experience, I don't know, because I sort of feel like these political intuitions are tied to something in human nature, which says, you can't just have a virtual reality. You can't just sit home and, have all the entertainment brought to you. You got to go out there and you got to look in people's eyes and you got to, see how they laugh at your jokes, see how they react to you, look at their facial expressions, right? So I think, I guess I'm postulating sort of a connection between these political instincts we have and just something deep in human nature.
So here's the thing, that movie theater existed. So that happened. So it didn't have the teleporting capability. It didn't have the special tube. So you still had to drive to it. But there was a theater in Los Angeles. If you ever had the chance to experience it, it was called the ArcLight.
Oh yeah, isn't that a chain?
It's a very small chain, and I believe it just it may be COVID finally finished it off, but like it was a very small chain.
Yeah,
it never got big.
We had a few of them. Yeah, we had a lot of them just right around here. Yeah.
Okay, so let me describe for people who haven't experienced the ArcLight. It's actually quite something. And I got to say, I was in LA for a little while and spent some time there, and I loved it. And I went there as often as I could, and I thought it was fantastic for all the reasons that you described. And I mean, let me describe the ArcLight experience for anybody who's been in a normal movie theater. So first of all, valet parking, right? Like you don't have to like find a place to park. They like take your car. Reserved seating. Right in the theater, right, and so you roll into this thing 5 minutes before showtime. You hand your key to the guy. You run inside. You have a reserved seat. You sit in your reserved seat. You know exactly what seat it's going to be. By the way, the seats are spectacularly comfortable. Right, it's just like it just feels like it's the softest, most pillowiest thing you've ever sat in. And then get this, great food, which they will bring to you in your seat. Right, and so it's like dinner time, and I'm going to have like a really good dinner while I'm sitting here watching this movie. And by the way, guess what else? Beer, right? Beer and wine, and so I'm able to like sit in my reserved seat with my glass of wine and with my great food, and I'm going to watch this like fantastic movie on this. And then, by the way, the most spectacular screen you've ever seen, like just these just gigantic wraparound screens, this like amazing sound. Like the whole thing is just like this magical experience, right? And it's like but then they pay for it, and so it's like the ticket price is like whatever, $15 instead of whatever it was at the time, $7 or whatever, right? So it costs, but like it's not like it's completely out of reach. And basically people went to it a couple times and they were like, wow, and then they just kind of went, yeah, right? And then they all bought flat screen TVs and started watching Netflix at home. So again, this gets to the thing of like, okay, it's a theory. It makes sense. It has existed. It was prototyped. It got a certain way. It didn't really take. Okay, so that so they didn't get into the right. The then what question, which was like, okay, should it have been should Hungary's been in the news this week? Should Hungary be subsidizing ArcLight theaters?
Yeah,
maybe. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I mean, okay. So I guess I do take that people's choices, the results of that very seriously. But can you think of sort of sociability and socializing as sort of as a collective action problem? So like so let's say you're in high school, right, and you have this friend. And you're interested in a girl, right? And maybe she's a little bit interested in you. Either way, and like you see this person every day. You sit next to them in class, right? And you get used to them and the relationship builds over time. Now, if school ends, right, if you're going to go off to summer it's like you're not in a position where either one can reach out to the other because the relationship hasn't developed to that point, or maybe you're just too shy and nobody wants to take the risk. But like if you're forced to sit in a seat every day and be with that person, right? Eventually something can develop, a friendship or a relationship or a marriage or whatever. And I feel like a lot of human relationships are like this. It's like things like school or like, militaries are like, classic where people like nobody would like just, you can't just, on your own decide I want to have a bunch of war buddies and just and just do that, right? There has to be it has to be organic. There has to be a war, and the government has to put you in these units, and maybe you develop relationships, and those become your best friends for the rest of your life. And so yeah, if everyone is sort of doing their own thing, right? You never get those kind of relationships. But if you have like institutions and ways to just sort of force people, sometimes they're wasteful. You don't want to start a world war so people can become buddies with their war with their platoon, right? You don't want to do that, but you do like it demonstrates sort of the point that it's not just the sum of our individual choices. Sometimes you need institutions and you need situations that sort of facilitate human relationships and communication, right? Any like 1980s movie where like a guy is like pining after the girl is sort of like this. He just happens to see her in his life, right? If he's making aggressive, attempts to see her over and over overtly, he's a stalker, right? But the fact that, they go to the same school or they hang out on the same beach or whatever, it makes it appropriate. And, there's a way to pursue that relationship. Does any of that make sense to you?
So you're gonna hate my counter argument on this one. You're just gonna okay. This is gonna be where you're gonna blow your top. So, everything you described does not match my experience growing up. So I remember something quite different, and I grew up in a very small town, rural environment. But basically, what I remember is like there was almost nobody there. I always wonder how many people who had the kind of experiences you're talking about got very, very lucky about where they grew up. And they got very, very lucky about what kind of school they were in, and they got very, very lucky about.
I was in a normal, even lower middle class school, not like an elite institution, not a big city, just a normal.
Well, let me ask. Yeah, well, let me ask what town was. Let me ask this: was there a college in your town?
No, there was not even close. The people who went to my school, it was a south suburbs of Chicago, and most people I went to school with probably never heard of the University of Chicago. I mean, that's how non-elite.
But it was in Chicago.
It was in the south suburbs, yeah.
Okay, so suburbs of Chicago. Okay, suburbs of Chicago. I did not grow up in the suburbs. Okay, now I'll pull the Middle America card. You grew up in the city. I did not. In a rural environment, it's not what you're describing. In a rural environment, it's basically how to put this. It's basically there's almost nobody to match with. Right, like it's like the the real world matching algorithm you're describing is sort of dependent on there being like a critical mass of possible matches, right? So that like statistics can like play out, and so that there's like some level of choice. Like most people do not grow up in that kind of environment, and I think that would be true for sure still in the U.S., and I think that's certainly true all over the world. This is this concept I talked to.
I think there's a lot of people growing up in suburbs of major metropolitan areas than there are in rural America. I think my experience probably is not that atypical at all.
I don't know. Well, like I said, it didn't match mine. So there's a concept I talked to Nicholas Holdo about, to make it conceptual for a second. So this concept I use called reality privilege, right? Which is it's just like growing up in a place where there are like a lot of interesting people to talk to, and there are a lot of interesting people to potentially mate with, and there are a lot of people who have shared interests. And a lot of people who can come together around, shared topics and have the kind of bonding that you're describing. Like, I think that's far from the universal human experience. And I think certainly on a global scale, like that's definitely not the universal human experience. And so I would argue there, like the internet provides what you're describing to a much greater degree than I think you give it credit for a much larger number of people than you think. And you might argue, and you may well argue that it does so in a way that's like, fake and, ersatz and not, not as good and whatever. And we could have that discussion, but like it does do that. And so, look, the ability to be a kid today and be able to be on the internet and have an interest or have a passion or have something that you want to talk to people about and be able to instantly match with a critical mass of other people who have the exact same interest is like, I think like a fundamental technological and societal breakthrough that's like greatly underestimated. because that was not the case where I grew up. And then, by the way, same thing on mating. Like, look, like, yes, I think that there's a real argument in favor of like the historical patterns for how people found mates. And of course, you all know, like, the right wing argument on this is, a lot of this couples to the decline of religion, right? Because, historically, like one of the fundamental, like, purposes of church was actually for actually development of mating, opportunities for people to be able to meet each other with shared values and be able to, get married and form families. So sort of a trusted, kind of safe environment within which to do that. And so, that probably started to decline pretty seriously, way before the internet, right back to like the 50s or something, when organized religion really started to decline. But there is this new way of doing that now, right? And there has been this, in the relatively recent past, quote unquote, internet dating went from something that's like weird and scary and creepy, to something that's like absolutely mainstream, and that, huge numbers of relationships and marriages and children are being generated through all these different online matches. And I'll give an example. We just had our first Clubhouse marriage, that I'm aware of, right? Which is like, two people met on Clubhouse and like then met in real life and then got married, on Clubhouse, right? And so, and yeah, look, you could argue that like, look, it's like if it's technologically intermediated, it's going to be like, I don't know, hyper optimized, or it's going to have the wrong criteria, or it's going to cause people to think there's too much choice or whatever. But like, it is nevertheless a way to do that matching. And it is a way to do that matching that for a lot of people is a superior way. And it is something that's actually playing out in large numbers. And so, I don't know. It's not a refutation of your argument. It's maybe an argument for there is some silver lining on the other side also.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to this, and whether we like it or not, or whatever we think, we're gonna go through this experiment, so we'll see what happens. Yeah.
Well, there's also just the sociological observation that the people who seem to be the most animated about the corrosive effects of the internet on our society seem to spend an awful lot of time on the internet, talking about the corrosive effects of the internet on our society. So.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, no, it's point taken. I just think. I mean, I don't want to come across as someone who hates technology. I think
Sure.
think we don't give enough credit to Google and Amazon, and the knowledge at your fingertips and the entertainment options. It drives me crazy when people criticize Amazon. When I'm a regular user of Kindle, Prime. Audible, right? Like, a huge portion of my life is plugged into Amazon, not mentioning, getting things. And I just think it's a good thing. My concerns are sort of very narrow, while people have more sort of broader. I guess human nature is changing and not work, and people aren't getting married and having kids. I guess that's not that narrow. I guess that's a little bit more. That's a little bit broader, but it's not all aspects of technology, certainly.
Well, the other thing, if we want to spend a moment on the getting married, having kids point. So, like, look, the other thing is like the getting married, having kids thing, is a problem. Again, it's one of these problems that predates the internet, right? Like, you know this, right? If you look, or you confirm for me this is right, that basically there's this broad pattern in the last 50 years that as societies across the world get wealthier, the birth rate drops.
Yeah,
is that fair to say?
That is true. Although we have reached new lows, and sometimes you do see an uptick in certain places, but generally you're right. It certainly can't be all blamed on the internet. I think the better data that maybe you can blame on the internet is just the number of people who have had sex. Well, this is sex in the last year. There's a sex session. I don't know if that's directly correlated to how many kids you have. You could be a virgin and then get married and then have a lot of kids. But there is some indication that people are just turning away from the idea of sex in relationships. This seems to be particularly bad in a place like Japan, which is sort of a place that's really plugged into technology and video games and all that. And the numbers of virgins and people who don't want any relationships are sort of off the charts. So you're right. There is this thing called the demographic transition. At the same time, there does seem to be something a little bit different going on in the last 10 years or so.
Well, let me come at it. Let me blame something that's not the internet for this, right? This is something we talk a lot about. So what are the traditional markers of, you could use the term the American dream, or you could use the term middle class, or you could use basically the concept of family formation. The idea of two young people being able to come together, have kids, and then be able to be in a setting that they believe is like basically high quality. What are the big markers of that, at least in the U.S.? And I would argue that there are three big components to that, right? There's housing, ability to have a house, have a home. There's education, which is the ability for the kids to have a great education, and then there's healthcare. right? And and basically, if you had basically plentiful quality healthcare, education, and housing, number one, you'd be fully like realizing the American dream for more people. You might also expect that maybe that would lead to an increase in both marriage rates and birth rates, because literally people would know that it was like, basically practically and financially tractable, to be able to do that, especially at a younger age, right? Like, for example, if the price curves on houses, schools, and hospitals were going down at the same rate as the price curves on, movies and TV shows and, flat screen television sets, right? I think we could probably agree that that would be positive on this point.
Maybe. I mean, I think it's more cultural than that. I mean, I think if you look at what predicts people have kids, there's actually probably a negative relationship between sort of living standards and how many kids you have. And, the few places that do have kids tend to be kind of religious community. I think, if I was going to say if I was going to say the internet had an effect, or recent years have had an effect on a number of children, I would be more inclined to put it on sort of cultural, political changes than I would be questions of affordability. I think that those are sort of second order concerns once values have shifted, right? I think the value shift is the more important thing.
Okay. Yeah, but then again, therefore, if it's the value shift more than anything material, then you'd also have to say, I would assume that the value shift that value shift does predate the internet. The internet. It may have been accelerated by the internet, but it predates it.
Yeah, that's what I would say. Yeah, I would say that like Zach Lorberg talks about the Great Awakening. Unquestionably, all the data is clear that the way the media talks about social and racial and gender issues and public opinion on these things just has a radical shift in the last 12 years. Yeah, I mean, this is stuff that's been happening since the 1960s, but you see like a super acceleration. I think that's what people are most worried about when they want to talk about wokeness, whether you put some of that on the internet, none of it or all of it, that's a question. But yeah, anyways, so we brought up education, and you brought up education as you brought up the education and healthcare as two places that could possibly be disrupted. I think in your article on software eating the world. How optimistic are you on that? Because the way I look at education, when sometimes I see people and they sort of, I think, have this sort of naive model. It's like, okay, you go to school to learn something, and you have to like travel to this place and listen to the professor. Oh, look, if you can just do it online, if you could just watch a video, and then be graded online, you have no need for schools. And I think that sort of misunderstands the whole point of schooling. Like, you're not really learning anything; you're just signaling. And if it's an arbitrary symbol, technology, it doesn't matter if technology helps you do it better, right? Because it's not about doing it well. It's just about arbitrarily jumping through hoops. And so that's why I think that, there's just these ideas and these government regulations and these systems of funding that sort of make education particularly difficult to disrupt. But, I'd be open to ideas, and I'd be optimistic if you told me that there was another way to look at it. This, maybe it can be disrupted.
Yeah, so I guess I'd say, look, I think I agree with a lot of that. But I guess what I'd say this is, I think the right way to think about education, consistent with what you just said, I think is education is in the U.S. right now, education is a bundle, right? And just take college as an example. Take college as an example. It's a bundle. So it's a bundle of in theory, skills and knowledge. It's a bundle of a credential. It's a bundle of social status. It's a bundle of daycare for young adults, right? It's a place to park, people whose frontal lobes are still not fully developed. They bundle housing in there, they bundle food in there. It's a social environment. It's a dating scene, right? It's a place to act out fantasies of rebellion, right? And it's a bundle of all those things, and I think we're basically dealing with the long-term consequences of just having like bundled all these all those things together and then pretending that it quote unquote is education, pretending that it then results in, I don't know, useful skills or the ability to live a better life or some such thing. And so I think it's very hard, and this is what the tech companies have found, which is like this is kind of your point, which is it's very easy to technologically innovate in the means of like delivering instruction or testing or any of these other kind of components of the quote unquote educational process. It's much harder to go up against that bundle, right? And you could argue like the dominant thing in that bundle is actually the signaling, right? The social status that results. And this is the Brian Kaplan argument, which you often hear people talk about with like the sheepskin effect, right? Which is somebody who completes 7/8 of Harvard does not make 7/8 the money as somebody who graduates, right? They make half the amount of money as somebody who graduates, right? So either all the skills in education are being loaded into that last semester, or it really is the diploma that is the signaling value as opposed to the actual skills. So look, this is my X-wing fighter is up against the Death Star kind of thing, which is kind of education startups coming out of tech. I think run kind of continuously up against this bundle or kind of matrix of value. And then all of the very heavily freighted societal implications, and all the other heavily freighted also governmental policy aspects, right? Like try to create a education startup that goes up against a system where the incumbents have access to unlimited federal student loan funding for free, right? Yeah. Like talk about a hard challenge. Like there's a hard challenge, right? And so, look, I think that's all true. And so from that standpoint, I think at least in our world, you want to be somewhat cautious about the degree to which you think this stuff could just be revolutionized through kind of a better user experience or something like that. Look, on the other hand, was it Herbert Stein, I think, who said that the famous line was, if something can't go on forever, it will stop. Like at some point, things just reach a level of absurdity. This goes back to our Uber discussion a little bit. Like at some point, it's just absurd. At some point, it's absurd to stand on the corner like an idiot waving for a taxi cab. Yeah. If you can just like punch up an Uber or a Lyft. At some point, it's just absurd to have your kid go, spend $80,000 a year for 4 years to get indoctrinated in a fringe political cult that results in basically being unemployable, right? Like, like at some point, I talked to a friend of mine. Oh God, a friend of mine who's it's a well-known Silicon Valley entrepreneur, very successful, very, by the way, left wing. And I was asking about his kids, and he's like, yeah, it's like my son, this, that, and everything. He's like, yeah, my daughter went to Brown. Now she's 25. She lives in Brooklyn. She stopped bathing and she hates me. I was like, I almost asked him, like, who pays for a credit card? And I decided to stop the conversation. I didn't want to get into it, right? And so, like, at some point, it's just like, okay, like, really, seriously, this is what we're doing, right? And at some point, as a kid, and of course, we see the other side of this in tech, like, like in tech, it's now kind of boomeranged around where, like, it's arguably a better credential in tech to have dropped out of Harvard than it is to have graduated. Yeah, right. And by the way, like Mark Zuckerberg, Harvard dropout, like Bill Gates, Harvard dropout, like there's, a whole run of these.
Yeah.
Right.
When Peter Thiel was doing his TL fellowship for people, it was sort of seen as this huge eccentricity, right? That was 10, 20 years ago that you'd pay people to drop out of school. You're right. Now that's fascinating the way you put it. It's a better credential to have dropped out of Harvard and Silicon Valley than to have actually finished.
So the Thiel Fellowship is super interesting because, like, and I would say, as with a lot of stuff Peter does, like even and I'm pretty open-minded on these things. Even I was like, really, like 19-year-olds? Like, and so basically, yeah, he paid a bunch of 19-year-olds basically to drop out of college, and then they all moved together into a group house in San Francisco, and then they were just basically told, go nuts.
Yeah.
Right. And like on the surface, you would just say, oh my God, what are you doing? Like, let's hope that 100% of them survive. Right. Much less like, and if you look at what that it's a very small number of kids. Like, it's one of the points Peter makes, by the way, is he's like, it wasn't that many kids. Yeah. Like people really freaked out, given the fact that it was like, I don't know, 20 kids or something. He said that it gives you a sense of just how important all the social signaling status stuff is. That, that the existing complex, he calls the existing university system, he says they're the Catholic Church, right prior to the Reformation, and they're selling indulgences. And like, they know full well what they're doing. They know they're corrupt. They know their system is like broken. And so, of course, they're going to like disproportionately panic at any indication that, they see Martin Luther walking down the street, they're going to freak out. But anyway, like if you look at that cohort of kids, and that is still, they've been successful beyond belief. Like, so if you want to say Ethereum, right? Like, Ethereum is $300 billion outcome in 10 years, a Thiel fellow. Figma, a company we're invested in, extraordinarily successfully, revolutionizing basically computer design. Thiel fellow. And there's another dozen of these that are like these really spectacular breakthrough, these people are doing like just incredibly fundamental, important work. Centered in tech, but of course it's centered in tech because that's where young people can do important breakthrough work these days. And so it's like, okay, there it is. Like, that worked, right? And it does kind of beg this question of like, okay, why are we not all doing that now at much larger scale? Like, there's something there.
Yeah.
It's yeah.
I think being able to select 20 people who've heard of Peter Thiel and who want to do that, I think is the point. Yeah, I went to law school at the University of Chicago. And I think it just showed me that even though you could have so many very, very smart people, and I just felt like law school was for people who had no idea what else to do with their lives. And that was sort of me too. I didn't go to a great college. I didn't know what to do. And so that's what they were there for. So yeah, I think the selection is everything. You're right, but yeah, you can encourage more or less of that. Not everybody can fund a Ethereum, but I mean, people can think about starting a hardware store instead of getting some worthless degree. I mean, I think that's realistic for people.
Well, so I think selection for sure selection is a big part of everything. So I totally concede the general point. I will say I'm sure it's not just 20, right? Like I'm sure it's not 2 million, but I'm sure it's not 20.
Yeah. Well, even if it's 1,000, I mean, that's still
not,
but yeah.
Like, how about that, right? And by the way, it's not like the class at Harvard. It's not like what's the Harvard undergraduate class. How many kids per year? Like probably a couple thousand, through 2,000 to 4,000
right.
Freshmen a year. Like that's not that big. And we load onto those kids the responsibility apparently for determining every aspect of how our society works. And so we're making some selection there already. And so, what's the total reporting staff of the New York Times? It's like 800.
Yeah.
Right. So anyway, yeah, look, I think there's going to be, so here's the way we think about it from a tech standpoint. It's like, look, you can't just go flat up against the bundle. You can't do a frontal assault on the Death Star. And even if you could, and people have actually tried to full on, create new universities and so forth, but you run up against the accreditation cartel, right? It's one of these, it's the government regulatory capture thing we're talking about, right? The universities are a cartel. They're a government supported cartel, right? And quite literally, they access to federal student lending is through the accreditation process. The accreditation process is run by the incumbents, right? And so the government has delegated to these institutions the ability to decide who gets to compete with them. And of course, the answer is nobody gets to compete with them. And so you have an almost perfect state of government. These are nominally nonprofits, but you would never know it looking at their cash flow statements. And so it is this idealized basically stagnant entrenchment of the status quo that is extremely powerful. And so you're not going to frontal assault it. What you can do, and what we're doing, is you can basically strip away pieces of it, right? So you can pull pieces out, and so you can for sure pull out the actual skills training part of it. By the way, you can pull out the dating part of it, right? You can pull out you can pull out a lot of the logistical components of it. You can pull out housing. You can pull out the food component. You can pull out a lot of the social setting stuff now. And then you get into the serious stuff. And then, of course, the really serious stuff is, can you re-credentialize, right? Can you figure out how to basically introduce new credentials, new forms of signaling, and new forms of status that are not just based on these legacy institutions? And that's what a lot of the best new founders are focused on. So it's the X-wing Death Star thing. Any individual effort probably won't work, but if we run enough experiments over time and strip off enough pieces, I think we might be able to start having an impact.
Yeah. Well, maybe, another possibility, maybe this is, I don't know if this is more about business or it would have to be somebody who's more philanthropically motivated. But, if, investing money in politics and changing the system, a lot of people do that, but I've always actually been surprised at how little money there is in politics. I just looked up the 2020 presidential election. 14 billion, was spent on that to elect the president. That doesn't seem like all that much money. And especially some of this stuff is very sort of technical. You just have to sort of capture the bureaucracy, get the right congressman to change things. Do revolutionaries, maybe they're emotionally overinvested in politics, but maybe financially and sort of strategically underinvested in politics? Does that make sense?
Yeah. So yes. So for sure, just on the facts, and again, this is not a value judgment, but just on the facts, for sure, there's not nearly enough money in politics. Exactly to your point, and it's just obvious in the arbitrage. You just think about put your pure finance hat on, and you're like, okay, there's going to be some regulation that's going to cause there to be $100 billion in value either gained or lost, which is not a crazy thing. That happens a lot. And so it's what should you spend as an economic actor to either cause that 100 billion to appear or vanish? Well, maybe not 100 billion, but maybe it should be more than 1 million, right? And a lot of these things, when they happen, you go trace back the amount of money involved, the amount of money that was thrown at it by all these supposedly super powerful, pressure groups and so forth. It's just not that much money relative to the stakes, right? So yeah, so there probably should be a lot more money in politics the way the system is currently conceived. It should probably be, I'm going to guess, 100 to 1,000 times more money than currently, and maybe more than that, given the, and of course the stakes keep rising, right? Because the economy keeps getting bigger, right? And so the stakes keep rising. So it's something like that. Now let me say, I think tech. I think we are the worst of everybody. I think the tech industry is the worst of every industry in every field in engaging in politics. And I think that some of that is probably just like flat out arrogance. But I also think part of that is it goes back to the selection point of like who's in tech. And the people who are in tech are basically right. So what is tech? Tech is the new fringe idea. Who are the people who go after the new fringe ideas? They are the new fringe people. We are iconoclastic. We are disagreeable. We are utopian. We believe in, first principles thinking. We don't believe in reinventing the wheel. We believe in, superseding the wheel with, nuclear powered spaceflight or something. If somebody says, here's how something has always been done, we say, well, then obviously we're not going to do it that way. And then the other thing with tech is really interesting is every other industry other than tech stabilizes, right? So at some point you just have a certain number of like movie, production companies. You have a certain number of car companies. You have a certain number of oil companies. You have a certain number of universities, right? And it's just a certain number of banks, and the industry just like stabilizes. And then those things, Ford, GM, and Chrysler for the last 100 years, right? Repeatedly bailed out, but the same three companies. And so at some point these industries stabilize, and at some point these industries, the people band together, they get to know each other, they band together and they form, kind of industry associations, lobbying groups, the MPAA and things like that. And then they start to exert serious political power. The problem in tech is by the time you get these companies to the point where they fully accept the nature of the challenge and they are run by the kind of people who understand all this stuff, they're no longer relevant, right? It's some new set of people and some new set of companies where actually all the issues are. And then those people are, again, these like super iconoclastic, disagreeable types that don't want to team up together and don't want to do the traditional thing. Mm-hmm. And so we in tech, just like my entire career, for 30 years now, I've been watching this happen. Like we so underpunch our weight relative to any other industry. It's just ridiculous. I can also tell you, I've concluded it's hopeless. I have totally stopped spending time on it. I will not engage anymore. Because I will not have these conversations anymore with people where it's like, yeah, I know we should do this, but we're still not going to. And so I think it's just like, it's going to be our lot in life as an industry that we're just always going to be on the receiving end of this stuff more than we're on the giving end. And look, that just like increases the pressure to like get the technology right and to actually like fly the X-wing fighter in the exact right, kind of vector through the gap in the shields. And so that's what we're focused on instead.
Yeah. Well, I'm interested to hear you say that you've sort of given up on tech ever being good at politics, because I thought your project, the website, the a16z.com, is it, where you have these sort of articles, is a sort of way to sort of marry the tech industry with people who are maybe in journalism or the social sciences or the are sort of thought leaders who are have a more tech positive view. Do you see the mission that way, or am I getting that wrong?
Yeah, we touch on that. We touch on that. So like it started with our podcast, and now we have this big effort called Future, which is more like a publication, an online publication. And so we do touch on that. We have a fair number of policymakers, politicians, policymakers who do read that stuff. One of my claims to fame is my piece on It's Time to Build. I got very complimentary messages back, both from Kevin McCarthy, who's the leader of the House Republicans, and he distributed it to his entire caucus. And then I also got a very nice note from Saikat Chakrabarty, who's the young DSA activist who created AOC.
Interesting.
So I don't know, I either did something very right or very wrong. But look, they read that. I don't know if my biggest claim to fame on this stuff probably is Dominic Cummings gives me credit for the slogan of the Conservative Party and Boris Johnson about a year and a half ago, right before COVID, was "Build, build, build." Oh, okay. And Dominic credits me for my essay on that. So anyway, look, there's some of that, and we'll do what we can. And look, we have various efforts underway. We're like in particular, we're getting increasingly politically engaged in crypto because those issues are getting very heated. That's actually a big issue this week. So we have people in our firm who are working on this hard, and we're going to support them in doing it. I just think this is not. Yeah, for the reasons I already described, this industry is not going to solve its problems of dealing with regulation of government through political activism. Like it's not going to be the main solution. it's the tip of the spear is going to be technological change, or it's not going to work.
Yeah, that's all fascinating. So yeah, mindful of your time, Mark. I know you're busy. Let me just ask you, just as a close, what are you excited about in America? I heard you say you're optimistic about it. What's your I guess what's your optimistic story of where we go the next 20, 30 years? Give me your pessimistic scenario, and maybe give me a median scenario if you can.
Yeah, so let's start the pessimistic scenario. I don't know if I'm an original thinker here on this one, but the pessimistic scenario is just simply lack of energy and lack of will, right? And so the pessimistic scenario is just simply, we could do all these things, but we just can't be bothered, right? And you could, the whole discussion we had, you could blame it on, anything from Netflix to the collapse of religion, any lack of kids, people not having kids. There's lots of possible causes of this, but like whatever those causes are, it's just this this feeling of just like, we could do these things, but instead we're not going to. We could do these things. Instead, we're just going to complain all the time. We could do all these things, but instead we're just going to, whatever, have our government jobs or have our UBI, or have our long COVID disability checks or whatever the new, way of delivering, kind of permanent government benefits is going to be. I chuckle because we don't even know if long COVID is actually even a real thing, and already we're going to have government benefits for it, right? So, right, and so it's just going to be probably Tyler Cohen's complacency thesis or something. It's just we just can't be bothered. We could, but we're not going to. Look, the optimistic case is, every single day, we go to work. It used to be in the office, now it's over the internet, but we go to work every day in our business, and we meet with the sharpest, young, aggressive, hungry, ambitious, innovative, creative people I could possibly imagine. Right. And they are so sharp and they are so competent and they are so driven. And I'll just give you they're so much better than I was, and they're so much better than my cohort was when I was their age. They're just way more advanced. They know a lot more about what they're doing than I did at that age. Right. And that I think is a direct payoff from the internet, because they just they go on the internet, they can learn all this stuff. And they come in with these just absolutely spectacular ideas, and they come in with the ability to recruit and be able to build these amazing new products and be able to wedge into these markets. And they've got all these creative ways to overcome all these problems that you and I've been talking about. And and they just keep coming. It's just wave after wave after wave of it's the most exciting video game in the world. And like I said, look, a lot of them it won't work out, but for the ones that it will work out, you can now get these, you can just have there are these fundamental breakthroughs, and there are these just titanically important both technologies and companies that come out of this process. And increasingly, by the way, cross-cutting into way more sectors of the economy, than when I was a kid. So, we're becoming more kind of systemically relevant. And so it's just this unending supply of these just, spectacular kids, basically. And so it is, at the end of the day, it is hard to argue against that for me.
Okay, great. So, Mark, you make the good case for optimism. I mean, you felt
semi optimism.
I think we have. I don't know whether you're optimistic. People are optimistic or pessimistic. I think the pessimism market is pretty saturated. I think that's most of what we get, and so it's good to just hear the case that people aren't making enough. So yeah, it's been great, Mark. I mean, it's been a great conversation. Thank you for this. It's great having you on.
Good. Fantastic. Thank you, Richard. Appreciate it.